Hey guys, I'm Tim with BleepinJeep.com. If you watched the last video, I pulled a Ford 9-inch and a Dana 44 out of a 78 F-150. In today's video, I'll be showing you how to add a back truss to the Ford 9-inch. I came down to my friend's shop, Rock and Road Performance in Loomis, California. Upon arriving, the first thing I did was I began taking apart the 9-inch axle. I started with the brakes, taking the drums off and pulling the springs, pads, shoes, whatever they are, taking all the innards out, which allows you access to the retaining flanges that keep the axle shafts. So with all the brake junk out of the way, there's a little access hole through the flange. I was able to get in there and unbolt everything, and it came out fairly easy. After that allows you to remove the third member from the axle. So zip all those bolts out, get that thing out of the way, pull it out of the housing, dump all the fluid, let it drain for a while. And after that, basically the axle is ready for removal of the old factory brackets, cutting all that stuff off, etc. It was pretty interesting cutting the old Ford brackets off the axle. Those were presumably welded at the factory. There's no reason to believe that they weren't. And all of the leaf spring perches were beginning to crack. They were all peeling off the axle, which is probably pretty common for something that's been used for 40 years. But I'm really curious if these were robotically welded back in the 70s or if they were all done by hand. On one side, the entire weld was full of porosity, and it wasn't actually visible on the outside of the weld, but as I began cutting into it, the whole weld was practically hollow. It actually cut amazingly easy. It was like cutting into a kitchen sponge or something. Another thing I noticed about the factory welds on the perches is they ran about an inch, maybe even an inch and a half past the old perch, and that used to be common practice to keep welds from splitting, but it obviously didn't work on this particular axle because they were splitting anyway. So that was just kind of an interesting thing to see. With all that stuff out of the way, I then removed the hardline from the brakes off the axle, and then I cleaned up the axle with a DA and then a wire wheel and got everything looking pretty smooth. One funny thing about the Ford 9-inch, as well as several other axles out there, in order to change your gear oil in the axle, you actually have to take your brakes apart. So you have to disassemble the whole thing and even remove your shafts a little bit so that you can pull that third member out and drain your fluid. I don't like that, and it's really inconvenient. So the first thing I did was I added a 3/8 inch thick skid plate to the bottom, which I then tapped with the same pipe thread as the factory fill hole, so everything matches and it's interchangeable. I made that skid plate really easily out of some 3-inch wide, 3/8 thick flat bar. I used a press here at the shop to kind of conform it to the bottom of the axle, and it ended up fitting pretty good, and I welded that on. With all that stuff out of the way, it was time to unbox the truss. The truss I'm using is available from RuffStuff, and if you're interested in it, take a look at the description below, and there will be a link down there. The Ford 9-inch was manufactured for a lot of years. Due to this, the truss will have to be fitted to your specific axle and may require a little bit of adjustment. In this case, I ended up cutting 2 5/8 inches off one side of the truss to get everything symmetrical. And then I made several trips to the bench and made some minute adjustments, sanding here and there just until things settled down and fit right. Preload. If you're familiar with welding trusses onto axles, you have heard the term preload. What preloading does is it prevents the axle from warping, because oftentimes when you weld, when you put a lot of heat on one particular side, or maybe not even oftentimes, almost every time you do that, if you put a lot of heat on one piece of material, it tends to curl or contract towards the weld or bend, and bent axles are not good axles. So in order to combat that, what people generally do when welding a truss to an axle is they basically have the center section of the axle lifted or elevated slightly, and then they strap, clamp, or bolt the tubes down and actually bend them opposite of where they'll be welding the truss, so that after it's all welded, it'll spring back to flat. So the question is, how much preload to add to the axle? In my opinion, that depends completely on your weld process. How hot is your welder set? How far are you traveling per weld? Are you welding the middle first? Are you welding the ends first? How many tacks do you have? All that. I think that's the big variable. What we decided to do was to preload the axle an 1/8 inch. but we didn't weld it preloaded. To begin, what we did is we placed the axle on the table and then shimmed it underneath the center section of the housing where it was machined flat, and that's the spot where the third member mates to. By placing our shims there, that ensures that the axle is basically flat. And at that time I took some base measurements off the edge of the table to the bottom of the tube on both sides. Off the top of the table to the bottom measures 1 5/8. And the driver's side tube is measuring 1 11/16. So it's just a 1/16 of an inch difference. So what we've done here is we've run this thick, heavy material underneath the table and then placed shims underneath the tubes, allowing for 1/8 of a gap here. So this equates to 1/8 inch less than what we have under the center. Then we're going to pull the axle tubes down until it just touches those. Then we're going to tack this whole truss on. Now this was a little bit of a gamble for me, but I decided that I was going to take my time welding this slowly and only weld 4 inches at a time, starting on the far outsides of the tube. If I had burned the entire weld seam in one pass, I probably would have left it preloaded, but I felt that the axle housing itself may be stronger than the truss, and I didn't want to have it stuck welded preloaded. So after tacking the whole truss, we undid the ratchet straps and everything sprung back pretty good. It took measurements again, and the axle had sprung back exactly to where it was. There was no change at all, except for having tacked that truss on with it preloaded. It has all this tension now, keeping everything tight together. From that point, the weld process was very simple, and I didn't use any clamps at all during the entire weld process. However, what I did do is I welded all of my beads from the inside out, and also as far away from the center as possible. My thinking with that is that if you have 2 tubes like this on the center of a housing and you put all your weld heat right here to begin with, it's going to want to pull right there. But if you start welding that truss on at the far ends, you're stiffening the whole unit before you get to the center. So by the time you do get to the center and you're welding it, it's not going to be able to do this. Another thing I did is I welded complete opposite ends, only 4 inches at a time. I would do the far end, the opposite end, the same weld, and then I'd flip the entire housing over and do it again, all broken up into 4-inch welds. It took me 2 hours to weld this entire truss, but after everything had cooled completely, we took measurements again on camera, and this is what we found. So this side here was exactly 1 5/8. See if it changed. We are exactly 1 5/8. All right, and the driver's side to begin with was a 1/16 different. It was 1 11/16. See what we got. We have exactly 1 11/16. No change whatsoever. As you saw, there was absolutely no change at all, no warpage, which I was really grateful for. After that, I DA'd the truss just a little bit more to clean things up in preparation for paint further on down the line. I also removed the old bearings, collars, and seals from the axle shafts. One of them was toast, one of them was in okay shape, but while it was all apart, I figured might as well. I installed the new bearings on the axle shafts, and if you guys want to see a video on how to do that, Matt has a good one, and I will put that in the description below as well. With the new bearings seated on the axle shafts, I placed the third member back in the differential and slid the axles into place. Alright guys, that is going to conclude today's video of the RuffStuff truss install on a Ford 9-inch axle. If you have not been over to RuffStuff's website, please follow the link in the description below and take a look at this truss and several other ones they have. If you're in the middle of a build, they also have a full line of builder products, and they are very high quality American-made items, so be sure to check them out. RuffStuffSpecialties.com. If you are not already subscribed to BleepinJeep, please do so. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your viewership. If you have any questions about this video or comments, please leave a comment. And if you learned anything in this video, please give it a thumbs up or a like and share it with your friends. It really means a lot and it goes a long way. All right guys, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Also be sure to stay tuned for phase 2 of this rear axle build, because I think it's going to be pretty sweet. But that is for another video.